You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for this day.
The new McCrispy Strip is here. Dip approved by ketchup, tangy barbecue, honey mustard, Sprite, McFlurry, Big Mac sauce, double dipped in buffalo and ranch, more ranch, and creamy chili McCrispy Strip Dip. Now at McDonald's. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 219, The Battle About Britain Part 3, The Three Speeches. This week, a big thank you goes out to Evan for supporting the podcast by becoming a member. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. This episode is going to be a bit different. And instead of focusing on a topic or a series of events, it is instead going to focus simply on three speeches. From May 13th to June 16th, 1940, Winston Churchill would give three speeches, which when combined make for some of the most memorable political speeches of all time. And they were all given within a 34-day period in the early summer of 1940. While at the time they were not named, they've become known to history through the most famous phrase from each of the speeches. On May 13th, just a few days after becoming Prime Minister, he would deliver the Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat speech to the House of Commons, during which he would discuss his plans as Prime Minister. On June 4th, the We Shall Fight on the Beaches speech was delivered to the House of Commons as a summary and update of the current state of the war in the aftermath of the successful evacuation of Dunkirk. Then, on June 16th, as the situation rapidly moved towards defeat for France, the third speech, Their Finest Hour, would once again be delivered to the Commons as a statement of the plans of the government moving forward. Even though all three speeches were delivered in the first 5 weeks of Churchill becoming Prime Minister, they've become the most well-known public statements he would probably ever give. All three speeches have been referenced constantly over the last 85 years. In every video about the Second World War, in countless books and television programs. And it just so happens that today, the day that this is released, June 4th, is the 85th anniversary of the delivery of the We Shall Fight on the Beaches speech, which is why I'm interrupting the narrative to talk about these speeches in particular. This episode will work through each speech in turn, discussing the context and the content of each of the speeches that were given by Churchill. And of course, that will require some focus on the famous last section of each speech, which I'm sure many of you will recognize as we walk through it. But there are also some interesting sections in each of the speeches that rarely find their way onto book covers. As always, when I'm discussing Churchill's speeches, my promise to you, the audience, is that I will do my best not to slip into a Churchill impression, because nobody needs to hear my Churchill impression. Hopefully we can get through this episode without that happening. The Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat speech, which for the sake of brevity I will refer to as Toil for the rest of the episode, was the first to be delivered and also the shortest. One of the major reasons for its shorter length is that it does not give an update on the status of the fighting in France, which at the time that it was delivered was still a developing and confusing situation. The German troops had only crossed the Meuse at Sedan on May 12th, and so it was still mostly unclear on May 13th that the fighting in France was not going to develop along the expected lines of a German invasion through central Belgium. Instead, Toil focuses on Churchill as the Prime Minister and broad statements about his policies moving forward. He'd only been made Prime Minister on May 10th, and it took some time to finalize the War Cabinet and to get all the bits of the new government together. The majority of the speech is just a recounting of these actions, providing assurances to the Commons that everything was in order. But he would also note that ensuring that all of the various ministries were filled completely would take some time, although he did have a good excuse. Quote, "To form an administration of this scale and complexity is a serious undertaking in itself, but it must be remembered that we are in the preliminary stage of one of the greatest battles in history, that we are in action at many points in Norway and in Holland, that we have to be prepared in the Mediterranean, that the air battle is continuous, and that many preparations have to be made here at home." End quote. Then Churchill drops into the first of his statements about his intentions. Quote, "I would say to the House, as I've said to those who have joined the government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." And this would be the famous quote that the speech would become known by. It's really, though, in just the final paragraph of the speech that Churchill really discusses what his plans are for the war, kind of moving forward now that he is Prime Minister. Quote, "You ask, what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer with one word, victory. Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival." End quote. These are the kind of bold statements that Churchill would somewhat be known for, showing a clear indication that Churchill believed that the only available course of action was to keep fighting, but they need to be taken in the proper context here. Churchill fully understood that these speeches were, they were not firm statements of policy. They were public relations opportunities. They were propaganda opportunities, and he made sure that he made the best of it. In these kinds of situations, he was sort of marketing himself, in a way, to the commons and also to the people around them. He would then end the speech for a call for united action. "Come then, let us go forward with our united strength." This also references the fact that when Churchill formed his government, he was forming a coalition government, a wartime coalition, not just one made out of conservatives like what Chamberlain had done before him. If toil was delivered at a time of uncertainty, the second speech, "We Shall Fight on the Beaches," which I will refer to as Beaches, was delivered at a time of seeming disaster. The speech was being delivered on June 4th, in the aftermath of the evacuations from Dunkirk, and the majority of the speech functions as a recounting of all of the events leading up to the evacuation and then the consequences of that evacuation. When I read the speech today, I get the sense that this speech is kind of written by Churchill, the writer, the history writer, the same person who wrote the World Crisis about the First World War, or the 6-volume history of the Second World War. It reads like a speech that's attempting to cover the course of a military campaign, more than a political speech. And honestly, if I just recorded the entire thing and released it on my podcast feed, some listeners probably would think it's a pretty decent podcast episode, if perhaps a slightly weird style. But it also is, of course, not entirely accurate. Due to limitations on information and then also the goal of Churchill during the speech, which was not to fully accurately portray what was happening, but instead to spin it a bit, kind of spin a bit of a tale of what happened and cast it in what he considered to be the proper light for the moment. This means you get lines like, quote, "The German eruption swept like a sharp scythe around the right and rear of the armies of the North. 8 or 9 armored divisions, each of about 400 armored vehicles of different kinds, but carefully assorted to be complementary and divisible into small self-contained units, cut off all communications between us and the main French armies." End quote. Now, this is a somewhat accurate summary of what the Germans had done, with a slight overestimation of the total German armored strength, which can be understood given the limitations of what the British knew. But then in that same paragraph, it ends with the sentence, quote, "Behind this armored and mechanized onslaught came a number of German divisions and lorries, and behind them again there plodded comparatively slowly the dull brute mass of the ordinary German army and German people, always so ready to be led to the trampling down in other lands of liberties and comforts which they have never known on their own." End quote. And just to repeat that last bit really fast, the dull brute mass of the ordinary German army and German people, always so ready to be led to the trampling down in other lands of liberties and comforts which they have never known in their own." End quote. That's not Churchill the historian talking there, but Churchill the propagandist, using the speech to emphasize that Germany is the enemy not just of Britain, but also of everything that is good and decent. The speech is not all doom and gloom, though. There's some positive things that are brought up about the actions of the British military. Quote, "The Rifle Brigade, the 60th Rifles, and the Queen Victoria's Rifles, with a battalion of British tanks and 1,000 Frenchmen, in all about 4,000 strong, defended Calais to the last. The British brigadier was given an hour to surrender. He spurned the offer, and 4 days of intense street fighting passed before silence reigned over Calais, which marked the end of a memorable resistance." End quote. Then much of the middle of the speech is spent on a series of paragraphs that I would summarize as Churchill emphasizing how horrible and bad things had been and could have been, and how close everything was to complete disaster. On the possibility of most of the troops at Dunkirk not being evacuated, he would say, quote, "The whole root and core and brain of the British Army, on which and around which we were to build and are to build the great British armies in the later years of the war, seemed about to perish upon the field, or to be led into an ignominious and starving captivity." End quote. This was a generally accurate picture of the estimates that were made before the evacuation began, that maybe 25,000 or so troops would be pulled off the beaches. It would have been completely gutting. It would have completely gutted the manpower of the British Army and would have set back their expansion plans maybe by years. Then on to the surrender of Belgium. Quote, "The surrender of the Belgian army compelled the British at the shortest notice to cover a flank to the sea more than 30 miles in length. Otherwise, all would have been cut off, and all would have shared the fate to which King Leopold had condemned the finest army his country had ever formed." And then finally, to the actions that were taking place around the pocket. Quote, "For 4 or 5 days, an intense struggle reigned. All their armored divisions, or what was left of them, together with the great masses of German infantry and artillery, hurled themselves in vain against the ever-narrowing, ever-contracting appendix within which the British and French armies fought." End quote. As discussed in the episodes on the events around Dunkirk, the German ground troops were not exactly throwing themselves, or hurling, as Churchill would say, themselves, at the British and French defenses. In fact, they let off the pressure a little bit because they did not feel that there was any real urgency in the situation, and they had just sort of executed a pretty long advance, so they needed a break. The next section of the speech then goes on to praise the Royal Navy and then the Royal Air Force for their actions during the evacuations. On the Royal Navy, quote, "They had to operate upon the difficult coast, often in adverse weather, under an almost ceaseless hail of bombs and an increasing concentration of artillery fire. Nor were the seas, as I've said, themselves free from mines and torpedoes. It was in conditions such as these that our men carried on, with little or no rest for days and nights on end, making trip after trip across the dangerous waters, bringing with them always men whom they'd rescued. The numbers they had brought back are the measure of their devotion and their courage." End quote. Then on the Royal Air Force, quote, "They tried hard, and they were beaten back. They were frustrated in their task. We got the army away, and they have paid fourfold for any losses which they have inflicted. Very large formations of German aeroplanes, and we know that they are a very brave race, have turned on several occasions from the attack of 1/4 of their number of the Royal Air Force, and have dispersed in different directions. All of our types, the Hurricane, the Spitfire, and the new Defiant, and all of our pilots have been vindicated as superior to what they have at present to face." About halfway through the speech, there's also a section that seems to point towards the same ideas that would become famous with Churchill's The Few speech, which would happen at the height of the Battle of Britain in August 1940. Because when referring to British fighter pilots over Dunkirk, he would say, quote, "There have never been, I suppose, in all the world, in all the history of war, such an opportunity for youth. The Knights of the Round Table, the Crusaders, all fall back into a prosaic past. Not only distant, but prosaic. But these young men, going forth every morn to guard their native land and all they stand for, holding in their hands these instruments of colossal and shattering power, deserve our gratitude, as do all the brave men who, in so many ways and on so many occasions, are ready and continually ready to give life and all for their native land." End quote. Churchill would end this section of the speech, again the majority of its length, by turning from discussing what had happened to what would happen in the future. Quote, "Nevertheless, Our thankfulness at the escape of our army and so many men whose loved ones have passed through an agonizing week must not blind us to the fact that what has happened in France and Belgium is a colossal military disaster. The French army has been weakened. The Belgian army has been lost. A large part of those fortified lines upon which so much faith had been reposed is gone. Many valuable mining districts and factories have passed into the enemy's possession. The whole of the Channel ports are in his hands, with all the tragic consequences that follow from that, and we must expect another blow to be struck almost immediately at us or at France." End quote. The final 4 paragraphs of the speech would then shift focus to the possibility of a German invasion. It would begin with a quite optimistic statement, though. Quote, "The whole question of home defense against invasion is, of course, powerfully affected by the fact that we have, for the time being in this island, incomparably more military forces than we have ever had at any moment in this war or the last." And then in the next section, Churchill gave some details about some of the actions that had been taken to arrest and detain many people within Britain, and not just individuals that were known supporters of Nazi Germany. Quote, "We found it necessary to take measures of increasing stringency, not only against enemy aliens and suspicious characters of other nationalities, but also against British subjects who may become a danger or a nuisance, should the war be transported to the United Kingdom. I know there are a great many people affected by the orders which we have made who are the passionate enemies of Nazi Germany. I am very sorry for them, but we cannot, at the present time and under the current stress, draw all distinctions which we should like to do." End quote. Now, looking back from the perspective of today, I find it interesting that there is such an open admission of using the excuse of war for such blatant disregard for any kind of rule of law, but that's probably just me being a bit naive. You know, this was a time when it was felt that the continuation of the UK, of Britain in general, was at risk, and so people were willing to kind of let happen what the government thought needed to happen. Everything I've talked about so far in this speech generally gets lost to history and is overshadowed by the final 2 parts of the speech. And it would begin with this statement, with the turning once again being in reference to the fact that the previous section had been spent on discussing the arrests that had been made that I just discussed. Quote, "Turning once again, and this time more generally, to the question of invasion, I would observe that there has never been a period in all these long centuries of which we boast when an absolute guarantee against invasion, still less against serious raids, could have been given to our people." Churchill then saw an opening for inserting more history and comparing the current situation in 1940 to the grand history of the British Empire. Quote, "In the days of Napoleon, of which I was speaking just now, the same wind which would have carried his transports across the Channel might have driven away the blockading fleet. There was always the chance, and it is that chance which has excited and befooled the imaginations of many continental tyrants." I like that quote because that is like a mix of Churchill the historian and Churchill the propagandist, mixing history and what had happened with this kind of heroic ideal of resistance. We've done it before, we can do it again. Then we turn to the final paragraph, and it is just a series of sentences that have been endlessly quoted over the years. From the first one that I used at the start of this podcast series. Quote, "I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made, as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once again able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary, alone." After that quote, he would turn to a statement that Britain and France planned to continue fighting. Quote, "The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength." End quote. Then we have the final section. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grips of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the New World, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. End quote. This part of the speech might as well be a motivational speech, and it does put on display why Churchill's speeches work, even if you read them or listen to them today. It's all about those short, sharp sentence sections and the repetitions of words and phrases and structure. You can tell he's building up in speed and emphasis, and that is one of the reasons it works so well as a propaganda piece. It's inspiring, it's memorable, it kind of glorifies even the possibility of defeat, and that even if that defeat happens, there's still some heroic end that will still occur. It's exactly what you want, I guess, in this kind of scenario. It's exactly what you want the final part of a speech to be, where you're trying to help motivate those around you to continue the resistance against Nazi Germany.
Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
Hey, Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
The third speech, Their Finest Hour, would be delivered on June 16th, and much like the Beaches speech that came before, would for the vast majority of its length be a way to convey information to the members of the House of Commons. It was an official statement about what had happened and what the expectations were for the future at a time when the overall situation in France appeared to be rapidly heading towards a French defeat. The speech was delivered after the renewal of the German attacks on June 11th, when, after a few days of fighting, they had once again broken through the French defensive lines that had been put in place under the leadership of General Weygand. This was the Case Red attacks that we covered in a previous episode. French surrender at this point appeared likely, and it was at this very concerning time that Churchill would again give a lengthy address that honestly has a pretty bleak tone. After discussing some of the events, Churchill clearly states that the middle of June 1940 was not the time to go hunting for who to blame for the failures of the Allied armies up to that point in the war, particularly anyone in the British government. He would say, quote, "Of this I'm quite sure, that if we open a quarrel between the past and the present, we shall find that we have lost the future. Therefore, I cannot accept the drawing of any distinctions between members of the present government. It was formed at a moment of crisis in order to unite all of the parties and all the sections of opinion. It has received the almost unanimous support of both houses of Parliament. Its members are going to stand together, and subject to the authority of the House of Commons, we are going to govern the country and fight the war." End quote. Part of this was probably Churchill trying to defend himself and those he worked with before the war, but there was no avoiding the fact that many of the people who had led Britain before the war were still in the government, not just Chamberlain, but many others. Being under the threat of invasion probably was not the ideal time to start having discussions about events from 5 years in the past. There would be plenty of time for that after the war, and I guess we're still in that time period now, given how much discussion there is of the actions of the British government leading up to 1939. Churchill would then move on to a bit of self-congratulations. Quote, The disastrous military events which have happened during the past fortnight have not come to me with any sense of surprise. Indeed, I indicated a fortnight ago, as clearly as I could to the House, that the worst possibilities were open, and I made it perfectly clear that whatever happened in France would make no difference to the resolve of Britain and the British Empire to fight on, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. Churchill was sometimes a fan of being self-referential. Although the next line that he would deliver is maybe a bit more questionable. Quote, "We have therefore, in this island today, a very large and powerful military force. This force comprises all our best trained and our finest troops, including scores of thousands of those who have already measured their quality against the Germans and found themselves at no disadvantage." End quote. I find this line a bit hard to square between Churchill's long sort of discussion of failures in France that came before it in this speech, and then the idea that the British Army did totally fine against the Germans. I think Churchill is being a bit optimistic, probably purposefully misleading here, but then he follows up with some completely accurate evaluations of the chances of a German invasion. Quote, "The invasion of Great Britain would at this time require the transportation across the sea of hostile armies on a very large scale, and after they had been so transported, they would have to be continually maintained with all the masses of munitions and supplies which are required for continuous battle, as continuous battle it will surely be." End quote. Now, the problem he points out here, the size of the invasion that would be required and the challenges of supplying that invasion force, would be the exact problems that the Germans would spend months trying to solve. It would be the entire theme of the planning of Operation Sea Lion that will be discussed in future episodes of the podcast. Amphibious invasions are actually really hard to pull off. Churchill was able to pull from his own experiences here with operations like Gallipoli, and to use them as a statement of expertise. Quote, "Here is where we come to the Navy, and after all, we have a Navy. Some people seem to forget that we have a Navy. We must remind them. For the last 30 years, I've been concerned in discussions about the possibilities of overseas invasion, and I took the responsibility on behalf of the Admiralty, at the beginning of the last war, of allowing all regular troops to be sent out of the country." End quote. Churchill's walking a bit of a fine line here. He probably doesn't want to remind people too much about Gallipoli, about the role he played in that amphibious operation, but he wasn't wrong that he had spent a lot of time at the Admiralty over the years as the head of the Admiralty, and there had been many discussions about protecting Britain from invasion. This would give him some authority to discuss in a little bit of detail what the Royal Navy was going to do against any kind of invasion. And he would spend a little bit of time sort of going over those pieces in the speech. We're going to go over those in a couple weeks on an episode, so I'll kind of skip those for now. He would then shift his emphasis to the air battle. Quote, "This brings me naturally to the great question of invasion from the air and of the impending struggle between the British and German air forces. It seems quite clear that no invasion on a scale beyond the capacity of our land forces to crush, speedily, is likely to take place from the air until our air force has been definitively overpowered." End quote. This gives Churchill an opportunity for one of his optimistic to the point of being deceitful lines. Quote, "But we have a very powerful air force, which has proved itself far superior in quality, both in men and in types of machines, to what we have met so far in the numerous and fierce air battles which have been fought with the Germans. In France, we were at a considerable disadvantage and lost many machines on the ground when they were still standing round the aerodromes. We were accustomed to inflict in the air losses of as much as 2 to 1 and 2.5 to 1. End quote. The loss ratio was nothing like that, unless you ignore British bomber losses and only count British fighter losses while still counting German bomber losses and German fighter losses. So he's being very deceitful here. That is not an accurate depiction of what happened with the RAF over France. Churchill then mentions the same advantages that I've actually mentioned in previous episodes when it comes to the advantages that the RAF would have once they were fighting over Britain instead of over France. Quote, "In the defense of this island, the advantages to the defenders will be much greater than they were in the fighting around Dunkirk. We hope to improve on the rate of 3 or 4 to 1, which was realized at Dunkirk. And in addition, all our injured machines and their crews, which get down safely, and surprisingly, a very many injured machines and men do get down safely in modern air fighting, all of these will fall, in an attack upon these islands on friendly soil and live to fight another day, whereas all the injured enemy machines and their complements will be total losses as far as the war is concerned." End quote. After some further discussion of the upcoming aerial struggle, Churchill moves on to discuss the status of the dominions. Quote, "We have fully informed and consulted all the self-governing dominions, these great communities far beyond the oceans, who have built up on our laws and our civilization, and who are absolutely free to choose their own course, but are absolutely devoted to the ancient motherland, and who feel themselves inspired by the same emotions which lead me to stake all upon our duty and honor." End quote. Shortly after this is my personal favorite line of the entire speech. Quote, "We may now ask ourselves, in what way has our position worsened since the beginning of the war?" End quote. The reason I find this rhetorical question hilarious is because he kind of doesn't answer the question and tries to spin it as some kind of positive about all the disasters that have happened over the previous 9 months to a year of the war. And he starts with this, quote, "It has worsened by the fact that the Germans have conquered a large part of the coastal line of Western Europe, and many small countries have been overrun by them." End quote. And then he would say, quote, "If invasion has become imminent, as no doubt it has, we, being relieved from the task of maintaining a large army in France, have far larger and more efficient forces to meet it." End quote. So basically what he's saying is Britain lost its most loyal and powerful friendly nation, but don't worry, that's good for Britain, because now it doesn't have to send a few divisions to France. Again, he's treading the line here between absolute untruths. But the core reason for Churchill's optimistic view would come a few sentences later. Quote, "I do not see how any of these factors can operate to our detriment on balance before the winter comes, and the winter will impose a strain upon the Nazi regime, with almost all Europe writhing and starving under its cruel heel, which, for all their ruthlessness, will run them very hard." End quote. This really calls back to the long-standing belief among British leaders, dating all the way back to 1933, that the people under the governance of Nazi Germany were at all times one wrong move away from a full-on revolt against the Nazi leadership. At every turn, the British were basing their strategies on this idea, from Munich through the leaflet-dropping campaigns to the blockade, and history would prove that view to be completely incorrect. In the next section, and I of course have to talk about this, Churchill would reference the Great War. Quote, "During the first 4 years of the last war, the Allies experienced nothing but disaster and disappointment. That is our constant fear. One blow after another, terrible losses, frightful dangers, everything miscarried. During that war, we repeatedly asked ourselves the question, how are we going to win? And no one was able ever to answer it with any precision." End quote. Churchill is absolutely correct in this analysis. The first 3 years of the First World War are a series of defeat and disaster for Britain and every nation fighting the Central Powers. But I do question the idea that just because things were a disaster the first time, it was okay that they were appearing to once again become a disaster. It's also worth noting from that quote, Churchill is hiding the fact that there's not a great way, at least, in the summer of 1940, there is not a clear path to victory for Britain. There is a clear path to continued sort of resistance. They control that, but they have no actual plan for victory or one that has a real chance of success. And so he's saying, oh, that's how it was last time too. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. When it probably really wasn't. Churchill then shifts to the events in France in 1940, which at this point, technically, the French had not yet surrendered, even though that seemed to be the course that they were on, and so there was some ambiguity. Quote, "However matters may go in France, or with the French government, or other French governments, we in this island and in the British Empire will never lose our sense of comradeship with the French people. If we are now called upon to endure what they have been suffering, we shall emulate their courage, and if final victory rewards our toils, they shall share the gains. Aye, and freedom shall be restored to all. We abate nothing of our just demands, not one jot or tittle do we recede. Czechs, Poles, Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians have joined their causes to our own. All of these shall be restored." End quote. Then Churchill moves on to his closing statements, first making clear the stakes of the coming battle. Quote, "What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life, and on the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us." End quote. Then emphasizing the two courses of the future, based on the outcome, he would say, quote, "Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad sunlit uplands. If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science." End quote. And then, of course, he closes out with the most famous line of the speech, once again, sort of calling for heroic actions in the hopes of final victory. Quote, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men shall say, this was their finest hour." The three speeches given by Churchill during this period are an interesting look into his mindset during this period of the war, but it's critical that they always be taken in context. They were not dishonest speeches, but they were also not meant to be purely honest statements of the state of the war, Churchill's mindset, the projected course of action of the British government. They are propaganda pieces, not in the purely negative sense of propaganda of trying to convince people of something that is untrue, but the more benign version of propaganda that is created to elicit specific emotions, to reinforce certain beliefs, and to push listeners towards certain actions. In these tasks, these speeches are a masterclass. This was their finest hour. We shall fight on the landing grounds and in the streets. We shall prove ourselves once again able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war. Those are great quotes, and these speeches are full of them. And while Churchill would give many more speeches in his political career, it would be these three speeches from May and June 1940 that would be the foundations upon which his legacy would be built. And some might say it was also his finest hour.